For 24 years, she held absolute power, silencing lawyers and throwing innocent people into prison, until a brave 14-year-old boy stepped into her courtroom and turned everything around. The air inside the Jefferson County courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama, was thick, not from the sweltering southern heat, but from decades of injustices that had seeped into every wall. Anyone who walked through those heavy oak doors knew the unspoken rules set by Judge Meredith Langford. Her cold, sharp gaze rarely lifted from her reading glasses. A single glance was enough to silence even the most seasoned lawyers in fear. Her voice was always soft and slow, yet full of authority, ready to crush anyone who dared to oppose her, until today. The oppressive, late summer sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting faint streaks of light across the courtroom of Jefferson County, Birmingham, Alabama. Inside, the atmosphere felt almost suffocating, not because of the heat outside, but due to an invisible pressure that seemed to weigh on every corner of the vast room. Above the bench, Judge Meredith Langford sat motionless, as cold and unmoving as a stone statue. With 24 years on the bench, Langford was not only known for her harsh sentences but also for her tyrannical, merciless attitude. The black robe of power draped over her thin frame like an impenetrable armor. Her gray hair, tightly pulled back, only served to make Langford's angular, dry face appear colder than ever. In Birmingham, especially in the black community, the name Meredith Langford was always spoken with sighs, bitter words of helplessness. For over 2 decades, many innocent black individuals had received harsh sentences simply because of her obvious bias. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood the unspoken rules of this courtroom. Wealthy white defendants always received favorable treatment, while poor black defendants were subjected to the harshest sentences. Today, in that familiar courtroom, a new case was beginning, but everyone understood that its outcome had likely been decided long before, like a play that had already been scripted. At the defendant's table, Tyrone Wills, a young black man, sat with a dazed look, his head bowed in despair. He was falsely accused of an armed robbery, and despite his best efforts to prove his innocence, deep down he knew. In this courtroom, the truth didn't matter. The courtroom was enveloped in tense silence as Langford opened the case file on her desk, not bothering to look down at the proceedings. A cold, silent contempt radiated from her, making everyone in the room feel uneasy. At that moment, the large courtroom door opened quietly, drawing curious gazes from everyone present. A black boy walked in, his steps slow but full of confidence. He wore a white shirt, neatly pressed khaki pants, his face serious, his eyes showing a maturity far beyond his 14 years. No one knew who he was or why he was here, in a trial that was clearly not meant for children. The boy walked over to sit in the spectators section, right behind the defense table. Curious glances from the jury, the lawyers, and especially from Langford immediately turned toward him. But Elijah Davis, this boy, remained silent, observing. No one realized that Elijah's appearance was no accident. It was the beginning of a series of dramatic, unexpected events that would unfold in this very courtroom. From the bench, Langford's cold eyes swept over Elijah's face, and in that fleeting moment a flicker of discomfort and suspicion appeared in her gaze. She was used to controlling everything in this courtroom, but the unusual appearance of the boy made her feel uneasy. And this was the start of a confrontation that even Langford, who held all the power, could not have anticipated. The heavy atmosphere tightened further, signaling that a fierce battle for justice was about to unfold. But at this moment, no one knew that the fairness which seemed long dead in this courtroom was about to come back to life stronger than ever, thanks to the courage and unexpected appearance of a mere 14-year-old boy. As Judge Langford's cold gaze shifted away from Elijah and returned to the papers on the bench, the familiar tension filled the room once again. The slow, heavy rustling of paper from Langford seemed to emphasize that the absolute power in this courtroom still firmly resided in her hands. For a long time, this courtroom had become her domain, a place where Langford freely determined the fates of those with little power, and no one dared to challenge her. Langford had never hidden her bias. In countless cases she presided over, most black defendants received much harsher sentences, even when the evidence was vague and unclear. She didn't bother to disguise it, for deep down, Langford was confident that the power she held would protect her from any accusations. Each cold stare, every gavel strike from her was a chilling affirmation of the blatant injustice that always existed, never once challenged. Silently, Elijah Davis sat at the back, his back straight, eyes intently observing everything happening around him. He wore no expression that stood out, but beneath that silence there was a strange power that was entirely inconsistent with his youthful appearance. Elijah's face clearly reflected the traces of his father, Joseph Davis, a renowned Supreme Court judge across the United States known for his integrity, fairness, and absolute commitment to justice. Elijah had grown up listening to his father explain the law, justice, and the responsibility to protect the truth with all his might. But today, Elijah wasn't sitting in the warm room next to his father. He was in this tense courtroom. This was the first time he had witnessed such blatant injustice. His eyes lingered on the desperate face of Tyrone Wills, a young black man whose hands trembled on the table, his head bowed in despair before a trial that seemed to have already been decided. Without thinking, Elijah felt his heart tighten, something within him urging him to act, though he wasn't sure exactly what he would do. At that moment, Judge Langford's cold, emotionless voice shattered Elijah's thoughts. The court will begin the trial of the state of Alabama versus Tyrone Wills, the defendant charged with armed robbery. Prosecution, please make your opening statement. From across the room, Prosecutor Philip Calloway stood up with a self-satisfied air. His youthful face, slick hair, and smug smile immediately made Elijah sense that this was the type of person who always benefited from Langford's favoritism. Philip was the ideal figure Langford always favored. White, from a wealthy background, ambitious, and completely loyal to her. Philip began his presentation, each word emphasizing the unfairness of the trial. He loudly accused Tyrone, presenting vague evidence and uncertain testimonies, all of which were repeatedly endorsed by Langford with approving nods. Elijah clenched his fist, trying to control the rising anger within him. But at that moment he remembered his father's words. You have to remember, Elijah. Sometimes the strongest thing is patience. Justice always needs the right moment to speak. Elijah calmed himself, his breath slowly stabilizing. Gently, he reached into his jacket pocket, carefully pulled out a small phone, and began discreetly recording everything that was happening in the courtroom. This was not an impulsive act of a thoughtless child. Elijah knew exactly what he was doing. A battle beginning with real evidence, and he would be the one to bring those truths to light. Up above, it seemed that Langford sensed something unusual was happening. She briefly furrowed her brow, her eyes scanning the room once more. But when she found nothing amiss, she quickly returned to her familiar cold demeanor, continuing to control the trial in the same way she always had, biased, cold, and ruthless. Langford had no idea that right in the courtroom where she had ruled with absolute authority, there now existed a factor she had never anticipated. A 14-year-old boy was quietly recording every act of injustice, and this boy was the son of someone with far greater power than her. The trial continued as usual, unjust, helpless, and filled with despair. But Elijah had made up his mind that he would not let it continue any longer. In silence, Elijah Davis had become the observer, the recorder, and soon, the one who would change the entire fate of this unjust trial. The small phone remained firmly in Elijah's hand, silently recording the scenes of injustice unfolding before him. At this moment, Prosecutor Philip Calloway had just finished his opening statement and returned to his seat with a confident smile, as if he already knew the outcome of the trial. Judge Langford turned her sharp, indifferent gaze toward the defense table, where Tyrone Wills sat hunched next to his young lawyer, who was nervously rearranging his papers. "Defense?" Langford's voice was flat, yet clearly impatient. "Please make it brief. I don't want to waste any more time." The young lawyer, Marcus Allen, stood up, slightly flustered but trying to regain his composure. He knew that what he was about to say was the only thing that could save Tyrone from an unjust sentence, though he couldn't help but feel a sense of hopelessness in the face of Langford's clear coldness. "Your Honor, my client Tyrone Wills is completely innocent," Marcus said clearly, trying to mask the anxiety in his voice. "We will prove that at the time of the robbery, Tyrone was not at the scene. We have witnesses, security camera footage, and clear evidence to support this." Immediately, Langford cut him off, her voice so cold it startled everyone. "Mr. Allen, this is not the time for a lengthy speech. I trust you understand that this is a courtroom, not a place for you to waste the court's time with vague statements." Marcus stopped, momentarily stunned by Langford's sudden harshness. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Sorry, Your Honor. I just want to clarify that the prosecution has no direct evidence proving my client was at the scene." Langford interrupted again, her expression one of clear annoyance. "Counselor, I'll say this once more. Keep your presentation to the point. I don't want to have to remind you again." In that moment, the entire courtroom seemed to freeze under the judge's blatantly obvious and shameless attitude. Tyrone lowered his head even further, his trembling hands resting on the table. He understood. Despite his innocence, his hope was slowly dying before his eyes. The injustice in this courtroom was so apparent that everyone could see it, yet no one dared to speak out against it. From the back row, Elijah continued to observe every small detail, his heart pounding harder as he watched Langford deliberately shut down the defense lawyer. The injustice was so evident it made him both angry and pained. His father, Judge Joseph Davis, had taught him that the courtroom was where justice reigned. But now, right before his eyes, justice was being twisted and trampled by the very person sitting in the highest position of power. Across the room, Philip Calloway calmly folded his arms, a smug smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He knew well that he had Langford's absolute backing. For Philip, this trial was not a battle for the truth. It was a scripted play. He and Langford were on the same team, the team of power and favoritism, where defendants like Tyrone would never have a chance to win. The defense attorney sat down, defeated, his head lowered in disappointment. He realized that no matter how hard he tried, his voice meant nothing in a courtroom ruled by Langford. It seemed everything had already been decided before the trial even began. Judge Langford leaned forward slightly, her cold eyes scanning Tyrone with undisguised contempt. She knew all too well the fear and helplessness of the defendant, and that made her feel even more confident in the absolute power she held. "We will proceed with the witness examination," Langford said, enunciating each word in a chilling manner, her gaze sweeping over Elijah's position one more time, as if to assert that no one could shake her power. But what Langford didn't know was that every unjust word she spoke, every dismissive glance she threw at Tyrone, Marcus, and the entire courtroom, was being silently recorded with perfect clarity in Elijah Davis's small phone. Elijah took a deep breath, the anger in his chest no longer an impulse. It had become a strong determination, a resolve that he would not remain silent, that he would not accept this blatant injustice continuing. And for the first time, Elijah realized that his presence in this courtroom was not by accident. He was here to directly confront the unjust power that Langford represented, to protect the very justice his father had dedicated his life to pursuing. The trial continued, and Langford's blatant injustice seemed only to have just begun. But from the back row, Elijah Davis, a 14-year-old boy, had made up his mind that he would not let this trial end the way Langford wanted. The real battle had only just begun. As Judge Langford's cold words echoed in the tense air of the courtroom, Elijah felt the palms of his hands grow damp with nervousness. He knew that the evidence he was gathering was the only key to uncovering the truth, but one small mistake, and all his efforts would go up in smoke. Elijah subtly adjusted his phone, keeping it low under the bench so no one could notice. His eyes quickly scanned the room, trying to observe every small movement from Langford and Prosecutor Calloway, making sure each moment of injustice was captured clearly. At that moment, the first witness was called to the stand, a middle-aged white man, the manager of the convenience store where the robbery took place. The man's eyes were filled with anxiety as Langford pressed him with her forceful questioning. "You're certain the robber was the defendant, Tyrone Wills, correct?" The man hesitated, glancing toward Tyrone with visible reluctance. I'm not entirely sure. The robber was wearing a mask. I couldn't see his face clearly." Immediately, Langford coldly interrupted, her voice dripping with threat. "Witness, remember your prior statement to the police. You clearly identified the defendant. I don't want to hear any inconsistent statements like this in my courtroom." The man quickly lowered his head, trembling as he answered quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." Elijah clenched his teeth, quickly recording the exchange. His heart pounded, but the tension wasn't over yet. Just then, Langford's sharp gaze suddenly flicked toward him, as if some strange instinct had led her to notice him. Elijah quickly pretended to look down at his shoes, trying to conceal the small phone in his hand. Several seconds felt like hours, and Elijah held his breath. When he looked up again, Langford had returned to questioning the witness, continuing to press him with biased questions, forcing him to confirm the testimony against Tyrone. Elijah's heart rate gradually slowed. He reminded himself that he had to be even more cautious, as every time Langford directed her attention toward him, it could spell the end of his plan. Suddenly, Elijah felt the gaze of Prosecutor Philip Calloway, who was sitting comfortably in his seat, a look of suspicion on his face. Calloway slowly tilted his head, his eyes fixed on Elijah. In a tense moment, Calloway slightly shifted in his seat, about to say something to Langford. Elijah quickly slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket, his heart racing like a drum, his face trying to appear as calm as possible. But just as Calloway was about to speak, a sudden noise from the jury box caught the attention of everyone in the courtroom. A juror had accidentally dropped a stack of papers onto the floor, the sound breaking the tension and distracting Calloway. He furrowed his brow in annoyance, turned away, and forgot about the suspicion he had just felt. Elijah silently exhaled in relief. He understood he had narrowly escaped danger. He couldn't waste another second. Elijah decided that now was the time to act swiftly and decisively. He pulled out his phone again, this time more carefully, placing it at the perfect angle to capture every action and every unjust word from Langford. At the bench, Langford's behavior grew increasingly brazen. She continuously dismissed any clarifying questions from the defense lawyer, while always supporting Prosecutor Calloway whenever he faltered in his arguments or lacked evidence. The favoritism was so blatant and glaring that even a few jurors began exchanging skeptical glances with each other. Elijah recorded it all, every action, every wrongful statement. He knew that what he was doing was not just the right thing, but also the responsibility his father had always taught him, to protect the truth at all costs. Langford continued confidently, unaware that every wrongful act she committed was being silently documented by a 14-year-old boy. She didn't realize that the absolute power she believed she wielded was slowly being undermined by the persistence, courage, and quiet determination of a child. While the courtroom remained immersed in the tension and blatant injustice of Langford, Elijah Davis had gathered all the evidence he needed. And even though he knew there were many dangers ahead, he understood that he couldn't stop now. The truth was now firmly in his hands, and nothing could stop Elijah from continuing his journey toward justice. The real battle had only just begun. As Elijah thought he had regained his steady breath, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew more tense than ever. He remained focused, quietly recording every act of injustice by Judge Langford. But just as he attempted to adjust the angle of his phone for a clearer shot, a small mistake occurred. The phone suddenly slipped from Elijah's hand, falling to the wooden floor with a soft thud, loud enough to break the suffocating silence that had enveloped the room. Every gaze immediately turned toward Elijah, as if a spotlight had been cast directly on him. Elijah quickly bent down, trying to pick up the phone, but it was too late. From the high bench, Langford's sharp eyes immediately locked onto him, her gaze filled with suspicion and barely contained anger. "Young man," Langford said loudly, her voice trembling with anger she couldn't hide, "what do you think you're doing? Are you filming in my courtroom?" The courtroom froze in an instant. Elijah looked up, anxiety flickering in his eyes. This was the first time he had been placed in such a direct, dangerous situation. But instead of looking away, he chose to remain silent and stare directly at Langford, as if challenging the authority she had long believed no one would dare defy. Langford jumped to her feet, her usual stern expression now completely replaced with uncontrollable rage. She angrily pointed at Elijah. "Officer, seize his phone immediately. I want that device handed over to the court, and get him out of here now." Two court security officers quickly moved toward Elijah. Those sitting around him began to whisper, confused by the sudden turn of events. But Elijah didn't budge. He took a deep breath and spoke loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I'm just recording the truth, Your Honor. If you've done nothing wrong, why are you afraid of it?" Elijah's clear, strong voice rang out, startling the entire courtroom. This was the first time anyone had dared directly challenge Langford, who had controlled this room with fear and absolute power for over 20 years. Langford's face turned red with fury. She slammed her gavel down on the desk, the sound sharp and cold like a final warning. "Enough! This is not a place for an unruly child like you to cause a scene. Get him out of here, immediately." The two security officers stood awkwardly beside Elijah, clearly uncomfortable with the harsh treatment of such a young boy. But under Langford's furious glare, they were forced to gently place a hand on Elijah's shoulder, signaling him to stand. Elijah reluctantly rose, but his gaze remained unwavering as he stared directly at Langford, unafraid. Before he was escorted out of the room, he managed to speak one last line. "You can throw me out, but you can't throw the truth out of this room." Langford stood still, like a statue, her angry eyes following Elijah's every step as he left the courtroom. His words felt like a crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall of power she had built. Yet Langford still believed her power was great enough to suppress any resistance, even from a child like Elijah. The courtroom door slammed shut behind Elijah, leaving an air of tension so thick it felt suffocating. But what Langford failed to notice was that, in that moment, many people in the courtroom began to question her and what she was doing. In the hallway outside, Elijah stood still for a long moment, his heart still pounding with tension and anger. But deep inside, he felt a stronger sense of resolve than ever before. The truth was no longer just in the phone, it was in his will. Elijah understood that he had officially stepped into a direct battle against injustice, and he knew that, from this moment on, the fight would be fiercer than ever. As the courtroom door closed behind Elijah, just before the officer could escort him away, Elijah suddenly froze. A strange force inside him urged him not to leave, not to walk out in silence, and let the injustice continue unfolding right before his eyes. "Wait!" Elijah spoke loudly, enough for his voice to cut through the door and echo into the courtroom. Everyone inside immediately turned toward the door, stunned by the boy's unexpected move. The officer hesitated, looking at Elijah, about to ask him to leave. But the determination in Elijah's eyes made him pause, and without realizing it, he loosened his grip on Elijah's shoulder. Elijah seized the moment, gently pushed open the door, and walked back into the courtroom, to the astonishment of everyone. Judge Langford furrowed her brow, her eyes, sharp as knives, coldly locking onto Elijah. Her voice, full of threat, rang out, "I think I asked you to leave, young man." Elijah took another step forward into the courtroom, his feet now firmly planted. He lifted his head and looked directly into Langford's eyes without any hesitation or fear. "Judge," Elijah said clearly, his voice confident enough to make the entire room fall silent. "You're not kicking me out because I'm using a phone to record. You're afraid that what I record will expose your bias." Elijah's words struck like a sudden thunderclap in a quiet sky, leaving everyone in the courtroom stunned, staring at him. Judge Langford froze for a moment, a flicker of panic crossing her face, but it quickly vanished, replaced by an intense anger never seen before. "What are you talking about?" Langford nearly shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "Who gave you the right to stand here and accuse me in front of everyone?" Without hesitation, Elijah took another step forward, now standing clearly in the middle of the room, directly facing Langford. "I'm saying that you are not fair. From the beginning of this trial, I've witnessed your clear favoritism toward the prosecution, and how you've continually pressured the defense and the defendant just because they're black. I believe everyone in this room has seen that, but no one dares speak out because they fear your power." Langford stood frozen, unable to believe her ears. She had never faced anyone who dared to confront her and expose her unjust actions right in the courtroom, especially not from a 14-year-old boy. The tense silence in the room felt like it was choking her. Prosecutor Philip Calloway quickly stood up, trying to salvage the situation, his voice cold as he defended Langford. "That's enough, boy. You're gravely insulting the honor of the judge and this entire court." But Elijah remained unmoved, his calm gaze shifting from Calloway back to Langford. "If Judge Langford is truly fair, as you just said, then why is she so afraid of a small phone in the hands of a child like me? I think everyone here knows the answer." No one in the courtroom dared respond. The tension in the air was palpable, but Elijah stood firm, unmoved. Even the officer next to him seemed uncertain, unsure of how to handle this unprecedented situation. At that moment, skeptical and doubtful glances began to emerge more clearly among the jurors, those who had quietly felt something was off about this trial. Every word Elijah spoke was like a small spark spreading, causing the belief in the fairness Langford had always pretended to uphold to begin to crumble. Langford sensed it. She took a deep breath, trying to keep some semblance of control, but her anger had now reached its peak. "I won't allow you to stand here and disrupt my court. This is a courtroom, not a place for a child like you to challenge authority." Elijah slowly shook his head, his eyes filled with strength and determination. "No, this is not a game, Judge Langford. This is a fight for the truth, and I will never remain silent in the face of the injustice you are causing." Elijah's decisive words jolted everyone in the courtroom as if they had been woken from a long sleep. They looked at the 14-year-old boy, who dared to stand up and accuse a powerful judge right there in the courtroom. And though Langford still stood there with what seemed like absolute power, she now understood one thing. This battle she faced was not just a challenge from an ordinary boy. It was a confrontation with justice, with the truth, with the very thing she had spent her career avoiding. This trial was no longer about Tyrone Wills. It had turned into a direct clash between power and justice. And Elijah Davis, the 14-year-old boy, was the courageous one standing in the heart of that battle. The tension in the courtroom remained thick after Elijah's blunt accusations. Judge Langford stood frozen behind the bench, her face shifting from bright red with anger to pale with shock. For the first time in her more than two-decade career of absolute power, she felt helpless under the growing scrutiny of the eyes that were now directed at her. Langford took a deep breath, trying to hold on to her authority for what seemed like the last time. "Officer, get him out of here now, and make sure this trial continues as planned." But before the officer could react, the large courtroom doors suddenly burst open, drawing astonished gazes from everyone inside. Two federal agents, dressed in sharp black suits, stepped in with a serious and decisive demeanor. Their powerful footsteps seemed to drown the room in silence. Langford's eyes immediately shifted to panic, something no one had ever seen from her. One of the agents, a tall man with hawk-like eyes, flashed his federal badge and spoke with authority. "Apologies for the interruption, but we have an urgent matter directly related to the trial currently underway." Langford struggled to regain her composure, her voice now laced with defiance. "Who are you to interrupt my court proceedings?" The second agent, a woman with an equally stern face, stepped forward, her cold eyes fixed firmly on Langford. "We are federal agents from the Department of Justice. We are here to investigate serious allegations that you have violated federal law in the course of this trial." The declaration struck like a bomb in the courtroom. Whispers began to rise as everyone struggled to process what they had just heard. Langford froze, her hands trembling slightly, though she still tried to maintain a stiff and stubborn facade. "This is a joke. I will not let you—" The male agent immediately cut her off, his voice cold, powerful. "Judge Langford, we're not here to debate with you. We are here with an official investigation order, directly related to allegations of racial discrimination, bias, and abuse of power on your part in carrying out justice." The tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point. Elijah stood silently, feeling the powerful shift in the atmosphere. His heart raced, not just from the tension but from a sense of relief, for he understood that finally, the truth was beginning to speak. Philip Calloway, the once confident young prosecutor, was now sitting motionless in his seat, his face ashen with fear. He knew better than anyone that if Langford fell, so would the only pillar of power that had long protected him. Langford tried once more to regain control, her voice weak but still attempting to challenge. "Until I see an official order, I will not let you interfere with my trial." The female agent immediately stepped forward, pulling a stamped document from her jacket and holding it up high for everyone to see. "This is an official investigation order signed by a federal judge. Judge Langford, we request that you immediately halt the trial and fully cooperate with this investigation." A complete silence fell over the room, as if no one dared to breathe too loudly. Langford stared at the paper in front of her, her body swaying slightly as if she were about to collapse. All the power she had once held now seemed to evaporate, leaving behind an older woman filled with desperation and fear. "This can't be happening," Langford whispered, as though trying to deny the undeniable truth before her. But everyone in the courtroom knew it was clear. The era of Langford's absolute power had come to an end. No one said it out loud, but all eyes turned toward Elijah, who stood tall with calm, resolute determination. It was his courage that had brought the true representatives of justice into the room, and the once unwinnable confrontation had now shifted. The trial abruptly halted, suspended in an atmosphere thick with tension and uncertainty. Langford lowered her head, desperately trying to conceal her panic, while Elijah quietly felt that this was the true beginning of the battle for truth and justice. In the moment when the tension in the room reached its peak, the courtroom fell into a heavy, cold silence, as if before a storm. Every eye was on Judge Langford, who was now trembling, staring at the investigation order from the federal agent. For the first time in her life, she truly understood what it felt like to have her absolute power torn to pieces right before everyone's eyes. The male agent lowered the document, his cold gaze fixed firmly on Langford, his voice booming with authority and resolve. "Meredith Langford, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of abuse of power, racial bias, and obstruction of justice in multiple trials, including the one today. We require your cooperation, and you are not to resist." Langford staggered, gripping the edge of the bench with her hand, her eyes wide with desperation and anger. Unable to contain herself any longer, she suddenly screamed, her voice, once capable of striking fear into many, now completely out of control. "You don't have permission. I am the judge. I represent the law. You can't do this to me." As she screamed, Langford stumbled backward, knocking over the chair behind her with a loud crash. Instantly, the atmosphere in the courtroom turned chaotic. Whispers and gasps filled the air. Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor who had always been under her protection, sat motionless, his face pale with fear, his eyes wide as he watched the once solid pillar of power crumble before his eyes. The two federal agents quickly moved in, and the female agent's voice rang out clearly, though sternly, "Judge Langford, don't make this any more difficult. Let us carry out our duties peacefully." But Langford refused to accept the reality. The absolute power she had held for so long had seeped into every fiber of her being. In a moment of desperation, she lashed out once more, her eyes blazing with hatred, shouting at the agents, "Stay away from me. You will pay for this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Her shout reverberated through the courtroom. Elijah stood silently, his gaze never leaving the judge, who had just lost all her authority. His heart ached, but not from fear. He could clearly see that no matter how strong unjust power might seem, it would collapse when faced with the truth. The two agents quickly closed in on Langford. The tall male agent grabbed her arm and swiftly pulled out a shiny pair of handcuffs. Langford struggled hopelessly, flailing and screaming, but it was all in vain. "Let me go. I'll sue all of you. I'll destroy each of your lives." The handcuffs clicked coldly as they were locked around Langford's wrists, leaving her frozen in shock and humiliation. All her earlier resistance turned into weak whispers. The absolute power she once held, the pride she once had, was now reduced to a pitiful and powerless figure, surrounded by the forces of justice. The entire courtroom seemed to go silent as they watched the once powerful judge being led away like an ordinary criminal. The jurors, The lawyers, even the officers who had once been intimidated by Langford, were stunned by the harsh reality unfolding before them. Before being escorted out of the courtroom, Langford turned to look back, her eyes locking onto Elijah's with a mix of hatred and desperation. But Elijah didn't step back. He looked at her with a calm, steadfast gaze, unwavering and resolute. The courtroom door opened and then closed behind Langford. The sound of the door closing seemed to echo, marking not just the end of an unjust trial, but also the end of an era of power from someone who had long disregarded justice. Elijah remained standing still, a strange lightness in his heart. For the first time, he fully understood that justice was not something easily buried by power or fear, and that the truth always finds a way to rise stronger than ever. The courtroom was completely silent now, but in that silence, everyone could feel one undeniable truth. The moment unjust power was overthrown was also the moment that justice began to speak louder than ever before. As the cold sound of the courtroom door slammed shut behind Judge Langford, a stunned silence descended over everyone present. They could hardly believe their eyes. One of the most powerful people in Birmingham, who had manipulated justice for over 2 decades, was being led away right before their eyes. In that moment, the female agent stepped forward, her gaze confident as she addressed the jury and the members of the courtroom. Her clear, authoritative voice shattered the suffocating silence. "Surely, you're all wondering how we were able to act so quickly and precisely. Let me reveal to everyone here today that the key evidence for this arrest was provided by someone very special." Her eyes slowly shifted toward Elijah, who was still standing firm in place, his eyes bright with unwavering belief. In that brief moment, everyone in the courtroom turned toward the 14-year-old boy with a mixture of astonishment and curiosity. The person who bravely recorded this crucial evidence, the female agent continued, is none other than Elijah Davis, the son of Supreme Court Justice Joseph Davis. Her statement hit the room like a jolt of electricity, leaving everyone stunned. Elijah Davis, the 14-year-old boy who had faced off with Langford, was the son of one of the most powerful and respected judges in the country. This revelation immediately flipped the narrative, showing everyone that this was not just the solitary struggle of a young child, but the powerful voice of true justice. Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor, was now pale and motionless, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He realized that he had just lost the one person who had protected him from the consequences of the bias he had long relied upon. The trial, once seen as a stage controlled by Langford and Calloway, was now completely out of their hands. One of the jurors could no longer hide their emotion, casting a glance of admiration toward Elijah. The others began exchanging looks full of meaning, all of them recognizing that it was the courage and bravery of this young boy that had shifted everything. Elijah stood quietly, his face showing no pride or sense of victory. Instead, he slowly scanned the courtroom with steady, unwavering determination, and spoke in a clear, strong voice. "I'm not doing this because my father is a Supreme Court justice. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Injustice will continue to exist if we remain silent and accept it." His words rang out with power, touching every heart in the room, moving many to genuine emotion. This was no ordinary trial. It was the most profound lesson about justice they had ever witnessed. The federal agent gently approached Elijah, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, a gesture of protection filled with meaning. The man spoke, his voice warm for the first time amidst the tense atmosphere. "We all owe you a thank you, Elijah. Your courage has brought justice to many who never had a chance." The courtroom once again fell into silence, but this time it was a silence full of emotion and respect. Elijah nodded quietly, his eyes softening, yet his determination remained unshaken. In that moment, he understood that his mission was not over, because the fight for justice never ends after a single victory. Amid the murmurs of astonishment and shock throughout the room, everyone now understood more clearly than ever that true strength doesn't lie in the power of those sitting on the bench, but in the courage to stand up and confront the truth, even if that person is just a 14-year-old boy. At the same time, in the hallway outside, Elijah's eyes met the proud gaze of his father, Joseph Davis, who had been there all along, unnoticed by anyone. The Supreme Court Justice smiled gently, a slight nod that spoke volumes, a meaningful affirmation for his son. Elijah knew that the battle against injustice would continue, but now he was ready to walk that path, for he was no longer alone. True justice had begun to speak, and that voice would never be silenced again. As Elijah's gaze remained fixed on his father, he gently turned back, his eyes sweeping over the courtroom, which was now enveloped in a profound and emotional silence. Everyone was looking at the 14-year-old boy before them with a mix of admiration and curiosity. How could someone so young have the courage to face such unjust power head-on? Elijah took a deep breath and spoke in a calm, mature voice that far surpassed his age. His words resonated softly, yet powerfully through the heavy walls of the courtroom. I know many of you might think I'm doing this just because my father is a Supreme Court justice, but that's not the case. I'm not here to exploit my father's power. I'm here to stand against the abuse of power, no matter who it comes from. The room fell into absolute silence. Elijah's words were like a small but powerful flame, illuminating the truth that many had long ignored. My father taught me that true justice never discriminates based on age, skin color, or social status. But in this courtroom, I've witnessed justice being distorted far too many times by those who hold power but lack responsibility, Elijah continued, his voice growing stronger, clearer. Everyone in the room seemed to be captivated by the words of this young boy. Elijah paused for a moment, his eyes drifting toward Tyrone Wills, the defendant still sitting there, his eyes filled with deep gratitude for Elijah. Elijah nodded slightly at Tyrone, silently promising that he would never stop until justice was fully protected. Then Elijah continued, his voice unwavering, filled with confidence. I understand. Speaking out against injustice isn't easy. But I also know that if I remain silent today just because I'm afraid, or because I think I'm just a child, then tomorrow another innocent person will have to suffer the pain of that same injustice. Elijah's gaze suddenly stopped on the jury box, where the adults were silently watching him, their eyes filled with emotion and respect. He continued, each word gentle yet powerful. We often think that injustice is something too vast, too distant for us to change. But I believe that each of us, young or old, has a responsibility to speak out against injustice whenever we see it. Silence is nothing but enabling that injustice to endure. As Elijah's words ended, a wave of emotion swept through the room, enveloping the entire courtroom in a deep silence. The older members of the room, including officers, lawyers, and jurors, were visibly shaken by the maturity of thought and action displayed by this 14-year-old boy. Even the seasoned federal agent couldn't help but smile, his eyes full of admiration. Elijah had not only provided critical evidence, but had become a living symbol of true justice, the kind that dares to challenge power to protect the truth and righteousness. Elijah lowered his voice, but his final words were clear and powerful. I stand here today, not just because I believe in justice. I stand here because I believe that we all deserve to live in a society where the truth is always protected and injustice is swiftly stopped. It is each of our responsibilities, and I believe that if we are courageous, we will succeed." In that moment, a juror stood up, followed by a second, then a third, until everyone in the room was on their feet, applauding. The applause was loud, sincere, and filled with emotion, not to celebrate Elijah's personal victory, but to honor the courage and the belief in justice that the 14-year-old boy had just shared. Amidst the resounding applause, Elijah felt his eyes welling up. He understood that what he had just done wasn't the end, but the beginning of a long journey. But now, he was no longer alone. True justice had spoken, and those in this courtroom would be the ones to stand beside him on the journey to protect the truth and fight against all injustices in the future. Amid the lingering applause echoing throughout the courtroom, the heavy doors slowly creaked open once more. Every head turned in unison, eyes filled with curiosity and anticipation, as a new judge began to step inside. The man walked slowly yet confidently toward the bench. He wore the traditional black robe of a judge. Tall and broad-shouldered, his graying hair, calm expression, and dignified presence commanded respect. His deep-set eyes carried a quiet wisdom, a lifetime of experience, and a profound sense of compassion. This was Judge Richard Thompson, a renowned black jurist known not only for his fairness and integrity, but also for his tireless fight for justice within a system long marred by prejudice. The room fell into a reverent silence, all eyes locked onto the new judge, as if awaiting a clear signal that something was about to change. Judge Thompson took his seat, adjusted his glasses slightly, and spoke in a calm yet commanding voice. "I have been fully briefed on the events that unfolded in this courtroom today. First, I want to recognize the courage, resilience, and sense of justice displayed by young Elijah Davis, who brought the truth to light under the most difficult circumstances." His eyes turned to Elijah, who stood quietly in place, respectful and humble. Elijah met the gaze with a small nod, feeling a deep sense of reassurance. He knew this man would do what was right. "It is now my duty to ensure that true justice is served swiftly and precisely," Judge Thompson continued, his voice growing firmer, more resolute. His eyes dropped momentarily to the case file in front of him, then rose to meet Tyrone Wills, still seated at the defendant's table, tense, but now with a flicker of hope in his expression. Based on the undeniable evidence presented by Elijah Davis, along with the timely intervention of federal agents, it is clear that this case has been manipulated and mishandled from the very beginning, Judge Thompson declared, each word landing like a drumbeat in the courtroom. Philip Calloway, the once arrogant young prosecutor who had operated under Langford's protection, could now only lower his head in silence. His face reflected shock and fear. He knew the power that shielded him had collapsed, and that he now had to face the consequences of his actions. After a heavy pause, Judge Thompson delivered his verdict with steady determination. For these reasons, the court hereby dismisses all charges against the defendant, Tyrone Wills. Mr. Wills, as of this moment, you are declared entirely innocent and will be released immediately. As the declaration echoed through the room, the courtroom erupted in a wave of joyful, emotional applause. Tyrone Wills brought his hands to his face, trying to hold back tears of relief. He turned toward Elijah, his eyes filled with overwhelming gratitude for the boy who had bravely stood up for truth and justice. Elijah gave a quiet nod in return, his heart light as he witnessed the moment unfold. Justice, the very thing he and his father had always believed in, had finally found its rightful place. Judge Thompson spoke once more, his voice softer, filled with emotion. Today's hearing is not just about restoring justice to Mr. Tyrone Wills, but also about sending a powerful message. True justice can only prevail when we have the courage to speak out against wrongdoing, no matter where it comes from or how powerful it seems. The applause returned, louder and more heartfelt than before. Everyone in the courtroom rose, honoring the new judge, celebrating Tyrone's freedom, and, above all, saluting the courage, responsibility, and unwavering faith in justice shown by Elijah Davis. In that special moment, Elijah turned his gaze toward his father, Judge Joseph Davis, who stood quietly in the distance, his eyes beaming with pride. Elijah knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but today he had done something truly meaningful. He had helped bring justice home and reignited a belief in truth within every heart in the room. As the applause began to subside, the courtroom fell into a deep, emotional silence, as if everyone was trying to etch the moment of true justice's return into their minds. Every gaze, no longer filled with doubt or tension, was now filled with a renewed sense of trust and hope, something they had not felt in a long time. From the defendant's table, Tyrone Wills slowly stood up. His legs trembled, tears still clinging to his eyes, but his gaze was now filled with happiness and deep gratitude. With his first steps toward freedom, he moved directly toward Elijah, who was standing firm. Elijah looked up, seeing the face of Tyrone, filled with emotions that words couldn't capture, emotions of an innocent man who had endured unimaginable suffering. Without a word, Tyrone knelt down, wrapping his arms tightly around Elijah, as though afraid that if he let go, everything beautiful in this moment would vanish. His voice quivered with emotion. "Thank you, Elijah. Thank you for not staying silent. Thank you for having the courage to speak out and believe in me when no one else would." Elijah smiled gently, placing a hand on Tyrone's shoulder as a gesture of encouragement. "You don't need to thank me, Tyrone. I just did what anyone should have done. You deserve to be free. You deserve to have justice protect you." Around them, everyone in the room looked on with clear emotion and admiration. From the new judge to the jurors, lawyers, federal agents, and even those who had once feared Langford's power, they all now realized that true strength lies not in power, but in the courage to stand up for justice. At the prosecutor's desk, Philip Calloway sat silently, unwilling to lift his head. He had completely lost the arrogance and confidence he once had, now replaced by a look of shock and helplessness. He understood that his greatest mistake was not only abusing Langford's wrongful power, but also underestimating the strength of the truth that Elijah had brought forward. At the back of the room, Judge Joseph Davis quietly walked toward his son. He placed a warm hand on Elijah's shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "I always knew you could do this, Elijah. You've shown everyone that courage knows no age, and that justice belongs to those who dare to protect it." Elijah looked up at his father, feeling the warmth and pride radiating from him. In that moment, he felt that all the hardships, pressures, and fears he had endured had been worth it. Meanwhile, the male federal agent stepped forward, giving a respectful nod to both Elijah and Tyrone. He spoke softly to Elijah, his voice sincere. "Kid, today you've changed so much. You didn't just save Tyrone, you've helped restore many people's faith in the justice system." Elijah nodded lightly, his eyes still shining with determination, and replied, "I just hope that others will see that we can always stand up against injustice no matter how difficult it may be." The new judge, Richard Thompson, quietly stepped down from the bench, moving closer to Elijah and Tyrone. He spoke in a warm, heartfelt tone. "Today, we have witnessed not only a trial being corrected in time, but also a valuable lesson in courage. Elijah, you have become a living symbol of true justice, and we all have a responsibility to follow your example." The applause rose once again, this time softer but full of sincerity. Everyone looked at Elijah with eyes full of admiration. The 14-year-old boy had now become a symbol of faith, strength, and courage in the face of the greatest pressures of power. The trial came to a close, and everyone slowly began to leave the courtroom, their hearts lighter and filled with peace. Elijah watched them, knowing that while the fight to protect justice would always continue, today he had helped them understand that each person has the power to change the world around them, if they trust and dare to speak out when needed. And as Tyrone Wills walked out of the courtroom, the sunlight outside seemed to shine brighter than ever, as if it too was celebrating his freedom and honoring the courage of a young boy named Elijah Davis, who had bravely stood up for justice, even when everything around him was against him. In the warm afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall window, Philip Calloway sat silently at his desk, his eyes vacant as he stared at the pile of messy documents in front of him. Never had he felt so lost and small. His most powerful benefactor, Judge Langford, had completely collapsed, and all the confidence and illusory power he had once relied on were now nothing more than an illusion, quickly fading away. Calloway lowered his head heavily, the bitter feeling rising in his chest clearer than ever before. He had once thought he stood at the pinnacle, protected by Langford's absolute power. But today, everything had been laid bare before his eyes. No power lasts forever if it is not built on truth, and injustice, no matter how cleverly hidden, will eventually be exposed. A colleague from the prosecution gently placed a hand on his shoulder, offering comfort. "Philip, everything will pass. The important thing is what you learn from today." Calloway looked up, his eyes filled with shame, but also a deep sense of awakening. He nodded slightly, finally admitting for the first time, "I was wrong. Wrong from the moment I thought I could exploit unjust power to win. Maybe today is the day I truly realize the consequences of disregarding justice." Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the hallway was filled with quiet conversations and light laughter. Elijah slowly walked out through the large door and immediately met the warm gaze of his father, Judge Joseph Davis, standing proudly, waiting for him with a smile. Father and son quickly moved toward each other, and Joseph gently wrapped his arms around Elijah. In that strong yet tender embrace, Elijah finally felt the relief after a long day of tense and challenging struggles. "I'm so proud of you, Elijah," Joseph Davis said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "You've shown everyone that truth and courage are always stronger than any power." Elijah squeezed his arms around his father, feeling a wave of emotion rise in his heart. He quietly replied, "I only did what you taught me. You've always said that justice must be protected at all costs, and I couldn't stay silent when I saw injustice happening right in front of me." Joseph Davis nodded gently, tenderly patting his son's head. He felt deeply moved by Elijah's remarkable maturity. He looked at his son with eyes full of love and pride, his voice becoming serious yet still gentle. "Today, not only you, but everyone here has learned an invaluable lesson. You've inspired them to realize that every person, no matter how small, has the power to change everything around them when they trust in the truth." As father and son continued their heartfelt conversation, several people walked past them from the courtroom, each politely bowing their heads in respect to Joseph and Elijah. Elijah saw the newfound trust and admiration in their eyes. In that moment, he understood that what he had done today truly meant something far greater than he had ever imagined. Further down the hall, Tyrone Wills stood with his family. He glanced once more toward Elijah, placing his hand over his heart as a gesture of sincere and profound gratitude. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Elijah felt his heart lighten more than ever before. This was the moment when justice truly found its way to those who dared to stand for it. In the bright hallway, Elijah stood beside his father, feeling the warmth and safety emanating from him. This emotional reunion was not only the end of a tense battle, but also the beginning of better things to come. But even now, inside the courtroom, Philip Calloway still sat quietly, accepting the grave consequences of his actions. His life from now on would follow a different path, one that he hoped would gradually help him rediscover the true value of justice. As for Elijah, he had now become a living symbol of courage and belief in justice, a symbol that people would always remember whenever they needed motivation to fight against injustice in life. In the soft evening light streaming through the tall windows of the courthouse hallway, Elijah walked slowly beside his father. The peaceful atmosphere seemed to gently close a long, tense, and emotional day. Joseph Davis placed his hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze distant and filled with contemplation and affection. "Today, you've done something extraordinary, Elijah. But I want you to understand that justice isn't a destination. It's a long journey that we must keep walking, no matter how many difficulties or challenges lie ahead." Elijah looked up at his father, his eyes clear but filled with reflection. "I understand what you're saying, Dad. I also realize that today's victory is just the first step. I know this fight will never stop with just one trial." Joseph nodded gently, his gaze now more serious. "You're right. People like Langford and those who exploit power to suppress justice will always exist. We can't change the world in a single day, but every day we can contribute to making it better. You must always remember that truth and justice need to be protected every day, every hour, with courage and determination." Elijah stood in quiet thought, then spoke softly but with resolute determination. "I will never forget this, Dad. I've seen clearly that silence in the face of injustice is to enable it. I want to continue fighting for those who have no voice, for those who are always forgotten or afraid." Joseph smiled with pride, gently squeezing Elijah's shoulder a little tighter, his voice becoming warmer. "That's why I'm so proud of you. Not because you won today, but because you had the courage to stand when everyone else was afraid or silent. That is the real victory, the victory of courage and truth." Father and son stood by the large window, gazing out at the wide, open sky. In that moment, Elijah realized that his responsibility had grown more than ever. He was no longer just a brave boy speaking out against injustice. He had become a symbol of faith and hope for others. Down the hallway, Philip Calloway silently exited the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting those of Elijah and Joseph. In that moment, Calloway realized that he had been wrong to underestimate the true power of justice, and the consequences he faced now were the deepest lesson he had ever learned. Elijah watched Calloway, then slowly spoke to his father. "Do you think he will change?" Joseph looked at his son thoughtfully, nodding with quiet reflection. "Anyone can change, Elijah. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that help us grow the most. Perhaps today is the day Calloway realizes his mistake, and maybe one day he will stand with us in the fight for true justice." Elijah smiled softly, his eyes filled with hope. He knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be times of exhaustion and discouragement, but he would always remember today, the day he stood up and made a small but significant change in the world. "Dad, I want to spend my life continuing to fight for justice. I know it won't be easy, but it's truly worth pursuing," Elijah said, his voice more certain than ever. Joseph smiled, looking directly into his son's eyes. He spoke gently. "I have absolute trust in you, Elijah. Always remember that every small action you take can create great changes. I will always be by your side, walking with you on that path." Father and son stood in the evening light, their hearts united in the strong rhythm of belief in the future. Today wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a long journey, the journey to fight for truth and protect justice, a fight that always needs brave people like Elijah to keep moving forward. And so, Elijah Davis's story has shown us that true justice is not in the hands of the most powerful, but in the courage and determination of each individual. Though only 14, Elijah dared to stand up, face injustice head-on, and change everything with his belief in the truth. What about you? If you were in a similar situation, would you have the courage to stand up for justice like Elijah did? Share your thoughts and your own story with us in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful and inspiring, don't forget to like, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue spreading positive and meaningful messages in life. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next stories.